Hey guys, it's Miss Sheehan, and today I'm going to do a lecture on imperialism in Japan and their reaction to that. So I'd like you to go ahead and take notes on this, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So first, I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures. So this is a picture of Japan in 1870. And here's a picture of the same place in 1930. Couple more, think about the differences. Military in 1853, obviously this bottom one is a reconstruction, versus military in 1914 in Japan. Okay, so today we are talking about the imperialism in Japan and what follows from that, which is called the Meiji Restoration. So in the 19th century, the 1800s into the 1900s, Japan went through a remarkable transformation. In 1853, as you read yesterday, Japan was closed off from outside trade. It was still mostly a feudal country. Technology had barely changed or grown since 1550. Its military still mostly used things like bows, spears, swords, and armors. They had wooden ships. They had a stable government and a peaceful, mostly rural agricultural society. Within 50 years, by 1914 and the beginning of World War I, Japan was a major trading and imperial power. It was a modernized industrial society with industry that began to rival things like England and Germany. It had a modern military with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. It had artillery. It had a navy with armored steam-powered gunships, and it was the most powerful industrial economy in 6,000 miles, definitely on that side of Asia. At this point, it was far more industrialized than China and far more industrialized than almost anywhere else at this point. So today we're going to talk about why this happened. Why is this their huge revolution in Japan? And it all has to do with imperialism. So this whole process began with something called the opening of Japan, which happened in 1853. So yesterday you read about what Japanese society was like before 1853. So this opening of Japan occurred when America forced Japan to abandon its traditional isolation and become America's trading partner. So let's look at how the US did that. So in July of 1853, a fleet of American ships led by this guy, Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into the bay at Tokyo, which was then called Edo. And he carried a letter from the president at the time, who was named Millard Fillmore, that demanded that Japan open its ports to trade and diplomacy. Now, why would the US want this? So if you think geographically, right, if you're on the west coast of the United States and you sail across the Pacific, pretty much the first place you get to besides Hawaii is Japan. So for the United States, starting to expand its power in the Pacific, Japan is an obvious partner that we need to have to trade with places like China, like Southeast Asia, or India, or the Philippines, right? So we basically, or the US at this point, wants to force Japan to open its ports to trade, which remember they had not done for hundreds of years. Japan at this point did not have the ability to defend itself against the American ships. It was completely outclassed. And Perry basically said, we're going to fire on Tokyo if you don't open to trade. We will destroy you. So the Shogun, who remember from yesterday, was the leader of Japan. Even though they had an emperor, the emperor didn't have any power. The power went all to the Shogun. He decided to sign a treaty with Matthew Perry, and that was called the Treaty of Kanagawa, and that was signed in 1854. That treaty basically said that Japan agreed to open 2 ports to the American ships, but they were not going to trade with the Americans. They were not going to let Americans bring goods in, and they weren't going to let Americans bring goods out. But basically, Americans could like come and visit, like Japan and Americans could have, talk to each other and stuff like that. However, Within a year, the US soon forced Japan to begin trading with them. And that set off like a domino cascade effect where once other European powers saw America beginning to trade with Japan, they were like, we need to get in on that too. So very soon, the British, the French, the Germans, they all start to begin to force trade with Japan. And they end up getting similar types of rights as they had in Japan, right? Whereas Europeans got to follow European law rather than Japanese law. There were much lower taxes on European goods. They could basically force Japanese people to buy European goods instead of Japanese goods, things like that. So at this point, imperialism in Japan was very similar to what was going on in China. And it almost looked like that would just continue, or even because Japan is much smaller than China, America or European powers might take over all of Japan itself. So at this point, as Americans and Japans are forcing, Americans and Europeans are forcing Japan to open, social and economic and political unrest is growing among the Japanese people, particularly among the samurai. And so they're basically saying, hey, Shogun, you signed this treaty and we're getting exploited and we don't want you to be in power anymore. So in 1867, the daimyo, I can never say that word, and samurai revolt against and unseat the shogun. So basically, they take away his power. And they decide to restore the then 15-year-old emperor to full military and political power. So he had been emperor because there had been a traditional emperor in Japan for hundreds of years. He didn't have any power. And now basically they say, okay, emperor, we think you can do better than the shogun. We think you can protect us from this imperialism. So we're going to give you political and military power. And the emperor takes the name Meiji, which means enlightened rule in Japanese. And this begins the period of what's called the Meiji Restoration. And this lasts from 1868 until 1912. So that's the Meiji Emperor there. And he was very young. And under the new Emperor Meiji, Japan makes westernization a priority. They wanted to become as much like Americans and Europeans as possible, because the thought was that the more like Europeans and Americans Japan was, the more it would be able to keep Europeans and Americans from taking control. So they saw basically what was happening in China, and they said, hey, or Japan said, hey, if we have an industrialized economy, if we have a strong military, we can potentially stop Europeans and Americans from taking over our entire country. And that's essentially what they did. So during this period, Japan adopted completely Western styles of clothes, government, and construction. So you can see here the Emperor Meiji is wearing kind of like a European style military uniform. They built a Western modern army and navy. They rejected many traditional Japanese customs and built a powerful industrial economy. So basically, they wanted to become just like Britain, or just like America, or just like France. They want to become a powerful industry, industrial, military, colonizing power in that European model. And they were pretty successful at it. And during the Meiji period, Japan became fiercely nationalistic. It became almost popular for Japanese people to believe very strongly in being Japanese and in being loyal to the emperor and to Japan itself. Right? It wanted to show that, like Britain or Germany or France, it was a great nation. And they began to pursue war, conquest, and imperialism to prove its strength to the world, right? Just like European and American powers were going out and imperializing and conquering places, Japan started to do that too. And in particular, it started to take over portions of China. Because remember, this period is just when China is starting to suffer the first effects of imperialism, and it's becoming very weak. So Japan starts to take over portions of China, and as the years go by, it begins to take over more and more and more, and this continues through World War II. So the Meiji government rejected all old things, including Japanese traditions. all remnants of old Japan were targeted for elimination, right? They wanted to become as much like Western countries as possible. Japan changed its army, government, education system, economy, clothing, and even hairstyles. So you can see here, these are some Japanese powerful men, and they're all dressed in suits or military uniforms with, you know, European style beards and haircuts, right? And so tomorrow, what you're going to look at is several of the things that Japan changed and kind of compare how things were before the Meiji Restoration in Japan versus after. Okay. So that's it for today. As always, you can ask me questions on Teams or via email or even in the comments. And I hope you guys are having a good day. Bye.